Hello everyone, welcome to our latest consultation here with the doctor. And for this one, well, it's a little momentous time for a number of reasons. First of all, I'd like to wish our author, William Shaw, a very happy birthday.
Thank you very much.
I think this is the first time we've celebrated an author's birthday on our program here, so that's brilliant. And then secondly, you are the first author that we have had back into the consultation room, and I hope that is like in no way reflective of like keep going back to the doctors, because we know that usually when we hear it's for great reasons of celebration. And of course, if I might hold it up, the reason we're here today is to celebrate this glorious delight and pleasure. Thank you so much for giving us another book in this series. You're just fabulous, and so we're here to celebrate the latest in the Cupidi series, The Trawlerman.
Well, I'm very privileged to be back. It's wonderful to be back, actually. I feel honoured. Not only on my birthday, but special birthday special, but the first person to come back. Thank you very much.
Can I just ask you before we get into the nitty gritty of The Trawlerman? It's 9 months since we last met online. How has your 9 months been?
Well, it's been mad, hasn't it? I mean, on the one hand, if you're a writer, I think you have the great privilege of being it's not like we got out very much in the first place, but also we have other worlds to escape to. I think that's kind of what we do. And I have actually found that very comforting during this time, is that I can make up stuff. That is my job. I don't have to be, I'm not working with people in all their real sort of nightmares and things. This is my tea just arriving.
This is wonderful.
Tea. Thank you very much.
Happy birthday cup. Excellent. A Moomin cup.
A Moomin cup.
Yes.
But, I think I've had somewhere to retreat. And I think it's been a lot tougher for those people who don't have somewhere to retreat.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, it's been, I've just cracked on with stuff.
It's interesting, isn't it? How previous existence might have prepared for current existence.
Mm-hmm.
I think I really miss being in the same space as authors and audiences, but I also think it has been an interesting way of meeting more people online, people that we wouldn't have met in those traditional spaces. So
completely,
that's not been a bad thing. Or even, getting to interview authors who would probably never have been able to make it to Newcastle or things like that. So
absolutely. I mean, I've been doing this thing called Reading Party, which is getting people to read from books online in a kind of group with the author. And that's something that wouldn't have happened in normal world.
Exactly.
People were willing to go a step further in that kind of event because we're all in this slightly different world. And also you meet people who don't get to gigs because of disability, or they live on an island somewhere, or they live in a completely different country, but they're fans of this particular type of, and they're all joining in. So the community is changing a bit, and that can't be a bad thing. I mean, it's been tough in lots of ways, but I love the way in which this also opened some new doors.
Indeed. And it makes me think we can't go forward doing what we used to do. I think we need to go forward and find those ways where we can keep as many people engaged, with writing, with discussions around writing.
And books have proved their worth. That's the really interesting thing. Books, I didn't realize until I sort of joined this sort of community of writers and readers how much books were social things that bring people together. And right now, that's truer than ever. And I think the fact that people can come together and talk about books has been really useful for a lot of people. And that's why we've seen book sales actually rise. I mean, apart from the fact we're all at home and we're spending less time maybe doing other stuff. But I think the fact that books are a social glue has been a real surprise to me.
Yes. Yeah. And with, I don't know, even with libraries being closed, but libraries have been able to put put their catalogue online, and and bookstores have been able to do click and collect, or or send out. So I think the book has found a way, and that is good, So speaking of books and the book, The Trawler Man, if I'm right in thinking, is this book 4 in the series?
Yeah, it's the fourth, and like the first 3 series, I put my hero, Alex Cooperty, through the ringer.
You really did, yeah.
And she's been in lots of really nasty situations, and the consequence of that. I mean, the great thing is we no longer write. We've got to convince you that murders are real. Therefore, we've got to make the people who deal with them real. Therefore, when terrible things happen to them, it's not like the old days of the Agatha Christie hero who carries on the same. These people have little chunks knocked out of them. So book 4, some large chunks have been knocked out of Alex Cooperty, and she's in a mess. And I think there's been lots of interesting discussions about people in the health service, people in the military, people in the police service with PTSD. What happens to people? And so I thought, well, let's do it about PTSD, and just that way, not a real cliche PTSD, just like what happens to people when they're in that sort of state that they get into, which they very often don't recognize themselves. And in mine, she doesn't really recognize she's got this thing, but it tends to have this. One of the symptoms that can very often be that you lose sense of time, and that things that happened in the past become part of the present, because you're in this continual emergency sort of setting because of PTSD. And I thought, in a narrative point of view, that was really interesting, that if somebody or other is really in this hypervigilant state, thinking something bad's about to happen all the time, actually, how does that affect a police officer? Because police officers have to think that something's bad about to happen all the time.
Yeah.
That's their job. And I just thought it was quite interesting to think about it. And I love to find new things out when I write. So I was just reading some of the stuff around the new neuroscience stuff, and I'm a complete amateur. So I'm probably, anybody who really knows their stuff will say, well, yeah, it's not as simple as that. But I really enjoyed finding that stuff out and using it as the texture for the book.
And I think, in doing so, I think what you afforded the reader, and especially the reader who was, is going to really appreciate this detective, is you gave us sort of like a greater behind the scenes look, in a way. It wasn't necessarily the solving the case and doing all the things, but we got to know more about her in this book, which I think was
good.
Which that idea, if you love a character already, and then you get to know maybe things that if this were in real life, you wouldn't find this out. You wouldn't get to hear about these things. But somebody like this wouldn't disclose.
Oh, that's really great to hear. That's wonderful. Because I quite like, well, for a start, when you start a series with a new character, I think one of the important things for series writing is you don't know everything about them. That's your journey of discovery, both as the writer and the reader. You have to find out more stuff about it. It's always a mistake. I used to be told when I was writing fiction that you had to know everything about your characters, and I was kind of thinking, oh, I must be a rubbish writer because I don't know everything about them. But then I don't know everything about my next door neighbor, and I don't know even everything about my wife or anything. Do you know what I mean? It's these things that you don't know everything about people. Actually, that's the real experience. So maybe if you don't know about your main character, you've got to learn stuff. So you put her in these situations where she's in quite, a fragile mental state. Her mental health is not great. And actually you end up finding a lot about a person in that sort of thing. She's not, by no means she's falling off the planet, but she needs a little bit of looking after. And paradoxically, it's her daughter. She's got a teenage daughter, and it's her daughter who does the caring, as is very often the case. And I talked to one person who had PTSD. They only realized later in life that their teenage daughter had been doing the caring.
Performed it.
Yeah.
Because I was gonna comment on the dynamic between mother and daughter, and the tensions that are around the teenage years. I thought they played out beautifully on the page. I found myself thinking, come on, Zoe she says to Mummy, I'm 17. This isn't a child. This is somebody who's finding their own boundaries, their own identity. And yet I could really sympathize with Alex. Oh, you used to be into this, and now you're into that. And what will it be next? And when,
yeah.
And I,
The thing is, at 17, you do think you're on top of the world. At 17, you think you're fully formed. And it wasn't until 30, looking back, I kind of knew who I was or had any opinions that were actually worth listening to. And I think that's the thing, is like, you're given a lot of power in our society when you're young, and it's very stressful on those people, isn't it? And you also think that you're there. And I think it's great when 16-year-olds get the vote. I think all that should be encouraged. But on the other hand, they're still quite annoying to adults, people that age. And she really, really, really annoys her. Her mum is really annoyed by this because she knows she's really bright and clever, but she's also deeply annoying and has the arrogance of youth.
Yeah. But let's just say, well drawn. When it was well drawn, that tension. Yeah. Thanks. Now, so if Alex is not able, because she's taking that time out, she can't help herself but get involved in this. But it's not her that's heading this investigation, is it not? And I wonder, before we talk about what the matter in hand is, could you tell us, for those of us who haven't read the series or been in the Jill, who is the one that takes on this case? Yeah.
Well, so imagine you're a middle-aged person, and suddenly the person who is your nearest sort of touch point in the police is this really good-looking, really completely insensitive person. There's all this jealousy between. She starts off, but quickly in the very first book, Salt Lane, she discovers that actually this woman is the smartest woman there. The one who is on the surface all about boys and makeup actually is the one who has it going on in her head and is actually in charge of stuff. So when she's absent, Jill ends out really having to do a lot of leading on this horrible murder, and does it very well. But all the time, Alex is kind of, she's not supposed to be serving on the police. She's supposed to be there, but she wants to put her arm around her and give her a bit of a helping hand. So she gets drawn back into it. And I really like Jill, because Jill's just the sort of, when you start a new workplace and there's this really annoying person, but actually 2 weeks later, you realize they're the person who really knows how this stuff works.
Yeah, and you should have judged so quickly. Yeah. No. Yeah. And I think, again, it's that sense of seeing somebody in their craft, as it were, not as a writer, but as an investigator. And it's like, yeah, okay, yeah, we can go with this. Now, as you say, the case in hand is not a pretty one at all. Could you tell us, because I don't think it's given anything away, but could you tell us about the victims and how they are discovered?
Well, there's this horrendous double murder at quite a large house on the South Kent coast, and husband and wife are found murdered under very bloody sort of circumstances, and it looks like a maniac has just killed them under very. There's clearly a narrative at work. There's blood on the walls. There's writing on the walls. The bodies are naked, and they've been clearly, one of them's obviously been told to get naked before being killed. So it's like, what's going on? So you want to know what's going on, and this really eats away at Alex Cooper. She's trying to work out how this narrative arrived. And of course, the narrative is something completely different. It's not what it appears. It actually conceals a completely different set of circumstances and was kind of designed to conceal those circumstances. But it's just very shocking in that kind of Gulf South Coast community that this very well-respected and well-loved couple should die in this way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, the idea of what you see is not necessarily what, and again, try not to say too much, not wanting to give it away.
Now, I know what you're talking about, but anyway, yes.
Now, there's also the elements that I wanted to talk about, because there is a scam.
There is a scam.
There is a scam. And I wanted to know about the research that you might have done into, how these things are established, who gets involved, why they get involved, and why it goes wrong.
Well, one of the very first thing I did was to talk to a forensic accountant whose job was to get to the bottom of what had happened in scams. And he said something which I found really interesting. He said, the thing about scams is that we think that the victims are the little old lady being tricked out of a savings somewhere. And he said that's not the case. If you look at the absolute maximum money being extracted from those sort of scams where somebody gets you involved in some financial scheme or something like that, the victims are the people who actually are quite experienced in investing, and they think they know a lot. And it's that danger of thinking they know something. And that's where the scam always happens, because they think they know something and they can always be pulled one step further over the line. And so it's actually quite often middle-aged men who are quite experienced at finance are the ideal victims, not the people who know nothing. It's actually the fact that if you know a little, you can be pulled in a bit more easily, because all the phrases that, you know, you give the key phrases about investment returns and you know, say the governments are kind of going to subsidize this, but we haven't told that, they haven't told anybody yet, so there's some more money going to appear. You know, all those little things, which is a bit nod and a wink, mean a lot more to the people who are already in that kind of business themselves. So they're more gullible than the rest of us in a funny kind of way.
You remind me of, there was an advert a year or so back on Classic FM, where there were like the scenario of 2 phone calls about investing, and they were saying, "Can you spot the fraud?"
Yeah.
You know, and again, it was that, you know, the words that were being used, and it was really difficult to spot which was the fraud and which wasn't. So,
and of course, the other thing that very often happens is that once somebody's been defrauded in these sort of social circles, because they tend to pass it on to their friends, they become very embarrassed. And so you get this sort of secret group of people who, and you know, it'll come out a year later how awful it was, but actually people, you're not going to ring up your best friend and said, "Oh, you know, that person I set you up with, maybe they're a bit dodgy," because you just think, "Oh God, what have I done?" So there's this strange sort of secrecy that goes around some of these things. You know, I know a mate who can do this. You know, it's a really special thing, getting on the ground floor. Anyway, that's the kind of scenario I'm trying to build.
but yeah, and as I say, I think, you know, what when I think of your writing, it always makes me think, yes, you know, there's going to be a crime, but this isn't going to be just your average bog standard. There's going to be more to this, and because there's more to it, you're going to learn about something else. And I don't want to say that I've learned to scam, but haven't, no, but that, you know, that there's, I don't know, it's like you get 3 or 4 or 5 different aspects when you pick up a William Shaw, you know, story. It's, yeah. And that brings me to asking about the notion of this reforesting scheme in Guatemala.
Yeah.
Now, of all the places in all the world to pick, did you put a pin in the map? Did you, how did you think, okay, this, we're going to set this aspect in Guatemala?
It's kind of a pin, because there's lots of them from all over, and there was a real rush of these reforestation scandals because they appeal to people who think they're going to do good by investing and still make $1 million. And there were lots of those things, especially where there's a hint where the government were getting involved, and the government were going to say, well, okay, for every pound invested, we're going to invest £1 of ourselves. So at that point, the investment scheme tapes up. Guatemala were involved in that, some of that stuff, but they didn't do that. This was the you know, the point was the Guatemalan government didn't do it, but actually a con man would say they might do it. You know what I mean? Because one of the things that behind the scheme is this person's got inside information on what the Guatemalan government are going to do to boost this reforestation scheme. And at the time, they were really popular. I mean, actually, I think they're probably getting a bit less popular now. They're falling out of fashion because we're now realizing that reforesting probably isn't the way to go. But they'll latch on to whatever the next thing is like that, won't they?
They will, and to be ever vigilant. But as I say, I was really intrigued. You know, Guatemala, so many places in the world to have chosen, and it's not necessarily a place that we often hear about. You know, so.
No. Yeah. Have you been there?
I haven't, and I should.
So should I. No, not at all.
Yeah, I mean the whole Central America. I wanted to go to Belize as well. You know,
lovely.
Yeah, and then the whole conservation aspect of you know what goes on in that part of the world, and why aren't there enough years in a life to be able to do everything?
Because we're not getting anywhere for the next year or so anyway.
No, we can dream about it, or we can read about it, which is good. Now the backdrop to all this, though, is we have the fishing community of Folkestone.
Yeah.
And you know, and it says, I read at the end, the thanks at the end of the book, that, you know, the trawlermen and their families, And I wonder, the time, did you spend time with them? Did you spend time interviewing them?
I went out with a guy. I mean, there's a really well-known crime writer called Quentin Bates, and he, in his youth, was an Icelandic fisherman, and he's now translator into Icelandic and a crime writer on his own. And when I said I wanted to write about trawlers, he put his hand up saying, yeah, I know quite a bit about them. And he put me in touch with this guy called Luke Noakes, who's a trawlerman down in Folkestone. He said, where are you writing about? Folkestone. He said, okay, I'll find you a trawlerman in Folkestone. And this guy, Luke Noakes, is somebody because he licenses, I don't know if he still does it, but Quentin actually writes the license. He gets people, he tests them and he licenses them. I mean, you need a license, obviously, to get your insurance and do all that sort of stuff for a boat. So this guy, Luke, when he was a young lad, was licensed by Quentin. So put me in touch. He was a really lovely guy, and from an old fishing family. His dad was a fisherman. His granddad was a fisherman, and you really got the idea that it's a few of them, and they're connected to a lot there, and they guard their fishing grounds quite carefully. It was very funny going out with Luke. I went out with him this time last year, actually, on his trawler, and he does it all single-handed. Because I wrote the book before I spoke him, because I was still in lockdown, and I went down there and I was thinking, oh God, how plausible is it to a guy gets lost overboard right at the beginning of the book. You hear about the guy getting lost overboard. How plausible is that? And then I'm seeing Luke on the boat, and he doesn't wear a harness, he doesn't wear a life jacket, and he's working in this incredibly hazardous environment. And he's done it since he was knee high. He knows his boat inside out, but he's married and he's got a kid, and his wife is keeping an eye on his boat from the shore. Like, he's working through the night. His wife's keeping an eye from the shore just to make sure his boat doesn't go straight for too long. Because if it goes straight for too long, then something's happened. And you kind of think, oh. And so I said to Luke right at the beginning, I said, look, I'm a bit embarrassed to say this, but this is about somebody dying on one of these boats and somebody falling overboard. Could that happen without somebody noticing? He said, well, actually, my granddad fell off the back of a trawler and he was never found. And you kind of think, and your heart sinks because you just trodden on something really raw there. But on the other hand, he was just really generous, saying, yeah, this is what happened. He got his foot caught in the nets, got dragged underboard. My dad jumped in to try and get him, and it was too late. He was dragged underboard. They didn't find his body for 3 weeks. And it turned up in Belgium. And you just think, this is a community that lives in a completely different world to the rest of us. And I know up in Newcastle, there's all that. There's fishing communities up that coast and stuff like that, but it's a tough old job. It's not like house painter or author.
It's not, isn't it? And to think that, given the dangers of the job and the times that we live in, where to sustain that profession is not easy at all.
No,
there are still those people where it's almost like a vocation, I think.
It is. And what's really interesting is it's really bound up with our British identity, that whole idea of anything that's maritime. We think of ourselves in Ireland, and the jobs like that are really important to us in terms of a nation and what we think about it. And in some ways, it's why the fishing community had such huge political power when there's very few people working in it. Just recently, I mean, it became a really sentimental thing about what happens to these fishermen, and it still is. I mean, life's not going to be very good for them. The turnout from whatever's going on has not necessarily been great for many fishing communities. But this guy has it; he's got it sorted. Their families know they've weathered lots of storms in the past, and he was there during lockdown, and he was saying, well, there's some advantages. We're selling direct to market in a way we never were. Fish prices have gone up because people want real fish. And it was one of those things in lockdown. Butchers and fishmongers were doing quite well because people turned to local shops. So actually there were positives for those communities, but hard work. It's a tough physical job. And I was seeing him do it in pretty mild weather, and he's got to do it all year round. One of the lovely things though was, like, I saw on his map, and he had all these little planes marked on the map. And I said, oh, they're on the maps. And he said, that's a Messerschmitt, that's a Dornier, that's a Spitfire. I said, oh, that's amazing. So they published these maps. He said, no, this is my map. I've marked all these on there and I know what they are because I picked up bits of them, taken to the museum, and said, oh yeah, that's a Messerschmitt. And so I marked them on. I don't give this to anybody else. So anybody else coming here with their nets is going to get them ripped apart because they don't know where all the wreckage is. And that's how he keeps that bit his. Do you know what I mean? He knows where all the hazards are. And some of the hazards are that very Kentish thing about keeping out the rest of the world. Kent's been a border of ours for a long time.
Yeah, I think it's it's easy to either forget or not even be in possession of that mentality. You know, I think if you live in other parts of the
Completely.
United Kingdom where, you know, that front line or that border might be in a different format, or with regard to, you know, different, I don't know, different aspects of life. Yeah, it's easy to forget that.
Yeah, it's easy to forget, and
Yeah.
you can't write the people down for having that mindset. You have to go and think. You know, Kent has looked at thought France is about to invade them for the last 2,000 years or whatever. Do you know what I mean? And that changes a mindset, and it does. And it's sort of like, you know, it's not necessarily, you know, it might have some very bad aspects, but it's also got very positive aspects.
Mm-hmm. And I was just thinking as well about that idea, though, of it being a solitary. I mean, at the moment, you know, that idea of one man takes his boat out, and one man, you know, it may be the end, because it's that, you know, that singular person doing it. So the other thing that I wanted to ask you about, though, is again, it's another strand that you weave in, and I love the closing lines. It is about that disgraced former colleague and what might be happening there between him and Alex.
Yeah, I mean, it was all this series came out of a book called The Birdwatcher, which kind of wrote it itself. And I wanted to I had this idea of a book where you knew that the main character had done something very bad right at the beginning. And at the beginning of The Birdwatchers, William South basically says, you know, he doesn't want to be on the murder investigation. He's talking to himself. He doesn't want to be on the murder investigation because he's a murderer himself. So it's not a whodunit, because you know who's done it all the way through. But actually, as the book goes on, you learn why he did this, and why he's done a terrible thing, and why you will forgive him for it. And Alex Cupidi is a daughter of a copper. She's a copper, so she has, at the end of the book, to do what a copper does to somebody who's discovered a murder. And that's the relationship, in that, you know, she saves him and she condemns him at the same time. And so he is really resentful of her, but he's quite in love with her. Mm. And I don't think she's quite ready to hear that yet. And so, and I'm going to keep that going as long as I can, quite frankly.
I think you should, but but I love the fact that, as you say, between these individuals, that however that bond might develop, there is definitely a deep, deep bond and an understanding of one another.
Yeah. No, I think she respects him enormously, and she's half, you know, he's half her husband, but not, and half her dad. Do you know what I mean? It's like that sort of, you know, really, he's her kind of guru in a weird way. And a sort of figure of experience. Never rose as high in the ranks as she has, but he's kind of looking out for her. And also he misses being a police officer, really.
And so it's always going to be slightly complicated, I think, because of the different aspects that you've mentioned. And now she, in this book, is, you know, I mean, she is still part of the force, but she herself, you know, has had the experience of being distanced from, you know, from what is at the heart. I mean, I think, again, you know, we talk about, you know, the aspect of being a fisher folk, where it's in the blood, you know, it goes deep. And I think the same is true of what we see of the officers. This isn't a job that you just go and do and walk away from. No,
I mean, I think, you know, I think it is, and I think it's got to be, for those sort of characters in those sort of books, that they have to be compelled, because, you know, in some ways you're writing a different thing. You know, you speak to real police officers and they don't serve in serious crime as long as we make our characters do it very often. That's generally part of their career, and they move through a lot, and policing's really complex now. What's one of the interesting things about crime fiction is you're kind of fictionalizing the police force in cahoots with the audience. I think the audience know it's not that. I mean, if a real murder investigation happens, there's 70 officers, civilians, all sorts of things, and the person who discovers the body is not the person who arrests them, and is not the person who does it. They all do tiny little parts, very professionalized if it goes right. But we've created a sort of fiction in which there's one person who's stuck on this. And if you do that, you've got to have somebody who's very committed to their job. So we're kind of it's like going back to what were the detectives in Golden Age. Well, how would they exist if there's that? So the only way she could exist is if she's absolutely committed to the idea of murder as an injustice. Now, if you've read it, actually, her aunt was murdered. And that goes back to another series, which you might, people don't sometimes get as connected. But, in a previous series, Cupid's aunt's murdered. So somehow the injustice is there in her, like the need to solve it. And that very much came from another thing, just to ramble on. I wrote a non-fiction book once set in Los Angeles, where I interviewed a lot of young men from in the late, sort of mid to late 90s about hip hop and music and their life. And I was really shocked as a sort of geeky white Westerner to find out that the trauma that lived through their lives, that they'd nearly all been witnesses to or victims of horrendous violence, and that the violence had never been fixed or uncovered by the police. The police had never worked out, really 9 out of 10 murders I talked about there had never been solved. And I think that absolute saw of what happens when things aren't solved, when a police force isn't able to make things better because of the chaos, really sort of inspired part of the thing is, like, I think if you feel that as somebody who's a victim and a solver, then you have to solve it, because it's really important you don't make things whole by solving a murder, but you actually do something to fix that horrendous situation of the gap of the narrative. And, I was speaking to like 19-year-old boys who'd literally seen people gunned down, their best friends gunned down before, and they didn't even know what started it. They didn't know why it had happened. And you could see that just having devastating consequences. There's one young guy, and I met him, and then he was killed in a drive-by shooting, and unless nobody was telling me, because I was an outsider about it, so I could figure out, nobody knew why. Nobody knew what happened in that 5 minutes before it. And that's horribly scarring, And so I think the police, she's got the kind of mentality that needs to fix that.
Yeah, because it's that understanding of the not fixed.
Yeah.
And so therefore, wherever I can, I will fix it for others. And maybe in the fixing for others, I get a slight moment of calm.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's exactly it. And, I can't make everything right, but I can, make this little bit a bit better,
Yeah. Now, I'm going to ask you a question that might be tricky, but hopefully not. And it's with this question that I'm going to bring our time together to a close, because I know you need to be going on and celebrating this day and this book as well. Of all the aspects of the Trawler Man, which aspect did you have the most pleasure developing?
It was absolutely that whole thing about what would the inside of your mind look like if you had the kind of PTSD that she does. And I may be completely wrong, but it was absolutely to discover that it actually, I think what you're all looking for is what's the right way to tell a story, and how can that work out, and actually to find that there was a way of telling the story from inside her brain that she wasn't aware of. And that's what I really liked about that. If you read the book, there's times when what's going through her head, and she wakes up in the morning, she doesn't even know it's gone through her head. People tell her what's been going through her head. And I think that disjunction between what you experience yourself and what's going on was really nice to find that it worked as a narrative thing, but it actually came from some of the research I was reading about how fractured your brains and your experience come. And it's great. Maybe it's exploitative of that condition to work out a way in which it adds to a story, but it really felt like, that felt good.
Mm-hmm. And for those of us, as I say, who may know very little about it, this might be, the way in that we start to learn about it and inspires us to find out more as well. So, Well, I do have one last question, if I'm allowed. Will Alex be back to full strength? Will there be a next one? And will she be back to full strength?
There is a next one. I'm writing something else actually that'll go in between, but she will start this next book. it depends which order I write the books in, actually, because it's quite useful sometimes to have a police officer who's not serving fully in the police force. It gives you a certain power. The fact that she's on what is euphemistically called light duties means that you can take her away and she can see different things. But I've got 2 books on the go with her, one of which is definitely straight back. She has to come back. She can't retire.
Yeah, please. Yeah. Thank you. William, it has been glorious to be in your company again.
Likewise. Hopefully one day face to face.
Please, that would be so good. I'm sure we will. I know we will. And it just remains for me to wish you all the very best.
Well, thank you. And thank you for such brilliant questions. That was really fun.
My pleasure. My pleasure. I'll see you soon.
See you soon.
Bye.